The hiss of the oxygen mask was the only steady rhythm in a room screaming with chaos. A cacophony of beeping monitors, shouted medical jargon, and the wet, ragged sound of a man fighting for his next breath filled the trauma bay. Chloe moved through it all like a ghost, her light blue scrubs a calm island in a sea of panic. At 18, she was the youngest nurse on the floor, a fact the senior staff never let her forget. They saw her quiet demeanor as weakness, her soft-spoken nature as a lack of confidence. They were wrong. "I need a line now," Dr. Evans barked, his face beaded with sweat as he struggled to staunch the bleeding from a GSW to the chest. "He's crashing, pressure's dropping to 70 over palp." "Brenda," the charge nurse announced, her voice tight with adrenaline. She shoved a tray of instruments toward another nurse, completely ignoring Chloe. "Get me another unit of ONEG, stat." Chloe was already moving. While they focused on the chest, she saw the secondary wound, a nasty tear in the femoral artery almost hidden by the blood-soaked trousers. They were losing him from his leg. Without a word, she grabbed a fistful of gauze, balled it up, and applied brutal, direct pressure to the wound, putting her entire body weight into it. "What are you doing?" Brenda snapped, finally noticing her. "The primary is the chest. He's bleeding out here," Chloe said, her voice low but firm, never taking her eyes off the patient's rapidly paling face. "He won't last long enough for you to fix his chest if his leg isn't controlled." Dr. Evans glanced down, his eyes widening as he saw the fresh pool of blood blooming on the floor beneath Chloe's hands. "She's right. Damn it. Get me a tourniquet." Chloe didn't wait. She held the pressure, her arms starting to burn, her knuckles white. She was a fixed point in the storm, her focus absolute. This was her world. The clean, sharp edge of crisis, where titles and seniority dissolved into the simple, brutal calculus of who was dying and who could stop it. The condescending whispers and dismissive glances from her colleagues faded away, replaced by the metronome of a failing heart. Then the doors to the ER burst open again, and a different kind of chaos entered. Not the frantic energy of saving a life, but the cold, predatory stillness of men who took them. They wore dark, impeccably tailored suits that seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent light. They moved with an unnerving synchronicity, clearing a path without touching anyone, their presence alone a physical force. In the center of them, on a gurney pushed by panicked paramedics, was another man. He was bleeding from a deep gash on his temple, and his left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, but his eyes were what held the room captive. They were dark, sharp, and shockingly aware. They swept over the scene, dismissing the doctors, the nurses, the equipment, until they landed on Chloe. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. He was taking in the sight of her, a young black woman in simple scrubs, her brow furrowed in concentration, applying life-saving pressure to a dying man. His expression didn't change, but something in the depth of his gaze shifted, a flicker of cold assessment that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Get him out of here," one of the suited men commanded, his voice a low growl. He wasn't speaking to the hospital staff, but to the paramedics who had brought in Chloe's patient. "We need this bay." "This is a critical trauma," Dr. Evans protested, his authority ringing hollow in the face of theirs. The man who had spoken took a step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Doctor, our associate requires your immediate attention. Your other patient's chances are statistically insignificant. Do not waste resources." The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. Chloe felt a surge of cold fury. She pressed down harder on the wound, her jaw tight. She would not let this man die because a wealthier, more important one had arrived. But the man on the second gurney, the one with the assessing eyes, lifted a hand. It was a small gesture, but it silenced his subordinate instantly. His gaze was still locked on Chloe. He said something in Korean, his voice a low rasp. The man who had spoken bowed his head slightly and stepped back. The tension in the room was a living thing. The suited men formed a silent, human wall, cordoning off their section of the ER. The hospital's own security guards hovered uselessly near the entrance, their faces pale. Chloe and her team managed to stabilize their patient and rush him to surgery. It was hours later, after the adrenaline had faded and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion had set in, that she learned who the other man was. Jin Woo Kwan. The name was whispered in the hallways, a mixture of fear and awe. Head of the Kwan family, a syndicate that ran half the city's shipping, logistics, and less savory enterprises from the gleaming towers of Koreatown. He'd been moved to a private suite on the top floor, the entire wing cleared out for him and his entourage. Chloe's shift ended, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. The image of his eyes was burned into her mind. She found herself walking the quiet, carpeted corridors of the VIP wing, drawn by a morbid curiosity she couldn't explain. The hall was patrolled by two of his men, their stillness more menacing than any weapon. They watched her approach, their faces impassive granite. She just wanted a coffee from the good machine at the end of the hall, she told herself. It was a lie. She stopped near his room, the door a heavy slab of polished oak. She could hear nothing. The silence was absolute. Leaning against the cool wall opposite his door, she let her eyes drift shut for just a moment. The exhaustion of the 36-hour shift hit her like a physical blow. Her legs felt heavy, her thoughts blurred. Just for a second, she told herself. Just 1 second of rest. She slid down the wall, her scrubs rustling softly, until she was sitting on the floor, her head tilted back, resting against the plaster. And in the profound, guarded silence of the hallway, surrounded by unseen danger, Chloe fell asleep. She woke to the sensation of warmth. Something soft and heavy was draped over her. Her eyes fluttered open, disoriented. A thick, cashmere blanket, the color of charcoal, was tucked around her shoulders. She was still on the floor, the hallway lights still humming overhead. One of Mr. Kwan's men stood a few feet away, his back to her, a silent statue. He hadn't put it there. The door to the private suite was slightly ajar. Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. She scrambled to her feet, the luxurious blanket pooling at her ankles. Had he been out here? Had he seen her, asleep and vulnerable on the floor like a child? A hot flush of embarrassment washed over her. She folded the blanket quickly, her hands trembling, and placed it on a nearby chair. She needed to leave. Now. But as she turned, the door opened fully. A different man, older and with a thin, disciplined face, stepped out. He looked her up and down, his gaze missing nothing. He was Min-Jun Park, Mr. Kwan's right hand, though she didn't know it then. "Nurse," he said. His English was perfect, accented only by its precision. "Mr. Kwan requires a change of dressing for the wound on his temple." Chloe blinked. "The floor nurse can?" "He requested you," Min-Jun interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. Specifically, a cold knot formed in Chloe's stomach. This was wrong. She was an ER nurse. She didn't do private care for syndicate bosses on the VIP floor. But the look in Min-Jun's eyes told her that refusal was not an option. Swallowing hard, she nodded and followed him into the suite. The room was less like a hospital and more like a 5-star hotel. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights. The air smelled not of antiseptic, but of something clean and expensive, with a faint, masculine note of sandalwood. And sitting in a plush armchair by the window, dressed in a black silk robe, was Jinwoo Kwan. His arm was in a sling, and a fresh bandage was taped to his temple, but he looked anything but injured. He radiated a kind of coiled stillness, a predatory calm that made the spacious room feel small and airless. He watched her enter, his dark eyes tracking her every movement. "You're the nurse from the emergency room," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." Chloe, she cursed the slight tremor in her voice. She walked to the medical cart, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she gathered sterile gauze, antiseptic wipes, and tape. It was an anchor of normalcy in a profoundly abnormal situation. "You fell asleep in the hall," he said, his voice a low baritone. Chloe's hands stilled. She kept her back to him. "I apologize. It was a long shift." "Do not apologize for being exhausted," he said. The command was soft, yet absolute. "It means you were working, unlike many in this hospital." She turned, her professional mask firmly in place. "I need to check the wound, Mr. Kwan." He gestured to the stool beside his chair. As she sat, bringing her face close to his, she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The scent of sandalwood and something else, something like smoke and cold night air, filled her senses. She carefully peeled back the old bandage. The cut was clean, stitched with neat precision, but the skin around it was bruised a violent purple. Her fingers were gentle as she cleaned the wound. She worked in silence, focusing on the task, on the familiar feel of gauze against skin. But she was intensely aware of him, of the way his chest rose and fell with each steady breath, of the fact that his eyes never left her face. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. He flinched, a bare tremor that shot through his body as her fingers brushed a particularly tender spot. His eyes squeezed shut for a fraction of a second, and a name escaped his lips, a breath of sound so quiet she almost missed it. Suman. The name hung in the air between them. His eyes snapped open, cold and hard again, the mask of control slamming back into place. But she had seen it, a crack in the granite, a flash of raw, unguarded pain. "Are you all right, Mr. Kwan?" she asked softly. He stared at her, his jaw tight. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "The medication," he said finally, his voice flat. "It causes memories." She knew it was a lie, a deflection, but she didn't push. She finished applying the new dressing, her touch as professional and detached as she could manage. But something had shifted. She had seen a glimpse of the man beneath the monster, a wound far deeper than the gash on his temple. The next day, the danger of her situation became terrifyingly real. She was in his room, charting his vitals, when a new doctor entered. He was young, with a nervous energy that seemed out of place. Chloe's instincts prickled. His white coat was a size too big, and his hospital ID badge hung at a slightly crooked angle. "Time for Mr. Kwan's antibiotic drip," he said, his voice a little too loud. He prepared a syringe, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly as he drew a clear liquid from a vial. Jean Wu was watching him, his expression unreadable. But Chloe saw it, a subtle tightening around his eyes. He knew something was wrong, too. The man approached the 4-line connected to Jean Wu's good arm. Chloe's mind raced. The shaking hands. The ill-fitting coat. He wasn't a doctor. He was an assassin. She acted without thinking. With a cry of feigned clumsiness, she stumbled forward, knocking a metal tray of instruments off its stand. It crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter of steel on tile. "Oh, my goodness, I am so sorry," she gasped, bending to gather the scattered tools. The distraction worked. The fake doctor startled, his head whipping toward the sound. In that split second of broken focus, Jean Wu's 2 guards, who had been standing like statues on either side of the door, moved. They were a blur of black suits and brutal efficiency. One had the assassin pinned against the wall, the syringe clattering to the floor, while the other disarmed him of a small pistol hidden in his coat. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Silent. Lethal. Chloe was on her hands and knees, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up from the scattered instruments and met Jean Wu's eyes. He was looking at her, not at the man being dragged silently from the room. His expression was one of cold, calculating intensity. He had seen what she did. He knew it wasn't an accident. In the aftermath, the hospital administration descended in a flurry of hushed panic. They offered Chloe paid leave, a transfer, anything to get her away from the epicenter of the danger. Minjun approached her in the hallway, his face grim. "Mr. Kwan has arranged for your protection," he said. "A plane ticket, a new identity, enough money to start over, anywhere you wish. You will be safe." It was her escape, a clean break, the smart choice, the sane choice. She could walk away and pretend the last 2 days had never happened. She could go back to her simple life of exhaustion and condescension, but it would be her life. Safe. She looked past Minjun, through the open door, to where Jean Wu sat in his chair, watching her. He didn't beckon her. He didn't plead. He just watched, waiting for her decision. To run from him was to run from danger. To stay was to walk willingly into its heart. "No," Chloe said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Thank you, but no." Minjun's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Why?" She met Jean Wu's gaze across the room. "He's my patient," she said, the words feeling both like the truth and a profound lie. "My shift isn't over." She walked back into the suite, the weight of her choice settling over her. She began cleaning up the mess from her manufactured accident, her hands moving automatically. Jin-woo remained silent until the door clicked shut behind Min-jun. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet room. She stood up, a pair of forceps still in her hand, and finally faced him. "You were in danger." "I am always in danger," he countered, his voice flat. "That is the nature of my life." "Not in my hospital," she said, a spark of defiance in her tone. "Not while you're my patient." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He said her name then, for the first time without a title. Chloe. It sounded different in his mouth. Not a name, but a discovery. A claim. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with a new and dangerous current. She had made her choice. Now, she would have to live with it. He was discharged 2 days later, and with him, so was she. It was not a discussion. Min-jun had appeared at her locker at the end of her shift with a simple black duffel bag. "Your things," he'd said. "Mr. Kwan insists you recuperate under his protection. Your apartment is no longer secure." She was now a resident of his penthouse, a gilded cage of glass and steel overlooking a city that felt a world away. Her life was measured in the silent nods of his guards, the gourmet meals that appeared without her asking, and the constant, unnerving awareness of his presence. He was a ghost in his own home, often gone for hours, only to reappear without a sound, his gaze finding her in the cavernous living room. The illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday. They were in his armored sedan, gliding through the rain-slicked streets of the city. Chloe was looking out the window, watching the blur of neon lights, when the world dissolved into a screech of metal and a concussive boom. The car lurched violently, spinning and slamming into a concrete divider. Before she could even scream, Jin-woo moved. In the chaotic, tumbling darkness, his body was a solid wall, slamming into hers, shielding her from the imploding window. Glass sprayed across his back as he covered her head with his arms, absorbing the brutal impact. The car finally shuddered to a halt, twisted and groaning, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber. For a terrifying second, there was only silence and the frantic pounding of her own heart. Jin-woo was a dead weight on top of her. "Jin-woo," she whispered, her voice tight with a panic so cold and sharp it stole her breath. He stirred, pushing himself off her with a low grunt of pain. In the dim emergency lights of the cabin, she could see a fresh line of blood trickling from his temple, his previous wound reopened. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough, his eyes already scanning the darkness outside.
No.
"You?" He ignored the question.
The doors were jammed.
Gunfire erupted from outside, the sharp pops silenced by the bulletproof glass. Min-jun, in the front seat, was already returning fire through a small gun port. They were trapped. They made it to a safe house, a sterile, anonymous apartment in a part of the city she didn't recognize. The escape had been a blur of running through wet alleyways, the sound of their footsteps echoing off brick walls. Now, in the quiet, the aftermath set in. Chloe had a shallow cut on her forearm from a shard of glass. Jin-woo was bleeding more freely, the dark fabric of his suit jacket stained black with his own blood. His men were securing the building, their voices low murmurs in the other room. It was just the two of them in the dim living area. "I need to stitch that," she said, her nurse's instincts taking over. He nodded, shrugging out of his jacket and unbuttoning his shirt with a wince. The wound was deep, a nasty tear in the flesh of his shoulder. He gestured to a medical kit on the counter. As she retrieved it, he did something that made her blood run cold. He pulled a sleek, black handgun from the small of his back and placed it on the table beside her. "The door," he said, his voice strained. "Watch it. Min-jun has a key. Shoot anyone else who tries to open it." She stared at the gun, then at his face. This was it. The final line. I've never. "It is simple," he said, his gaze hard and unwavering. "You point and you pull the trigger. Do not hesitate." Her hand was shaking as she picked it up. The cold, heavy reality of it was sickening. But the thought of another assassin, another attempt on his life while he was weak and vulnerable, was worse. She took the gun. While her mind screamed in protest, she held it, its muzzle aimed squarely at the door. With her other hand, she began to clean his wound, her movements sure and steady despite the tremor that ran through her entire body. She had crossed over. She was no longer just a nurse. She was part of this, an accomplice. Later, after the wound was stitched and the adrenaline had bled away into a profound weariness, they sat in the dark. The gun lay on the table between them, a silent testament to the choice she had made. "You should have taken the plane ticket," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "I know," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the weapon. He was quiet for a long moment, watching her. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Stripped of its usual command, it was raw, honest. "In the hospital, I watched you sleep in the hallway. You looked peaceful," he paused, as if the word was foreign on his tongue. "I have not seen peace in 10 years. Not since they killed my sister, Suman." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was heavier, a confession. He wasn't just protecting her. He was protecting what she represented, an innocence, a quiet strength that his world had long since extinguished. She was a flicker of light in his endless dark, and he was terrified of it being snuffed out. The war escalated. The rival Choi clan, enraged by their failed attempts, changed tactics. They couldn't get to him, so they would get to her. One morning, Minjun brought her a plain manila envelope. Inside was a photograph. It was her, smiling, in her cap and gown at her nursing school graduation a few months prior. A thick, red line, like a smear of blood, was slashed across her face in the picture. On the back, one word was written.
Soon.
They knew who she was. They knew where she came from. The threat was no longer collateral. It was personal. It was aimed directly at her heart. Jin-woo saw the photo, and a change came over him. The cold, calculating control he always maintained solidified into something infinitely more dangerous. It was the stillness of a predator that has finally chosen its prey. The Choi clan had made a fatal mistake. They had threatened the one thing he was not willing to lose. He began planning a final, decisive strike. But he tried to lock her away, to shield her from the coming storm. He forbade her from leaving the penthouse, doubling her guard. "This is my fight, Chloe," he told her, his voice leaving no room for debate. "You will remain here, where it is safe." "There is no safe place, not anymore," she countered, her fear eclipsed by a defiant anger. "They targeted me. That makes it my fight, too." She wouldn't be a damsel in a tower. She had held a gun for him. She had stitched his wounds. She would not be hidden away when the real battle began. Over the past weeks, she had been more than a patient. She had been a quiet observer. She listened to the hushed conversations, pieced together fragments of information. She knew the head of the rival clan, Mr. Choi, was older, proud, and suffered from a severe, life-threatening allergy to shellfish, a fact his own men guarded jealously. Anaphylaxis. It was her world. It was a weapon they would never anticipate. She told Jin-woo her plan. He refused, his face a mask of thunder. It was too dangerous. He would not risk her. "You move like a hammer, striking everything head-on," she argued, standing before him, refusing to back down. "But sometimes, the quietest poison is the most effective. Let me be your poison." The final confrontation was to take place at a neutral location, a high-end restaurant in the city's financial district, for a supposed peace talk. Mr. Choi would be there, surrounded by his men. Jin-woo's forces would be waiting outside, ready to move in, but a direct assault would be a bloodbath. They needed an edge. Chloe was that edge. She entered the restaurant not as a nurse, but as a waitress, her hair pulled back under a cap, her face partially obscured. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she carried a tray of appetizers to the private room where the meeting was taking place. She had paid the real waitress her entire life savings to take the night off. She saw him immediately. Mr. Choi, a pompous man with a cruel mouth, holding court at the head of the table. Jin-woo sat opposite him, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were like chips of ice. They flickered to her for a barest fraction of a second, the only acknowledgement that he knew she was there. Her target was a small dish of shrimp dumplings. With a sleight of hand she had practiced for hours, she used a tiny dropper to add a concentrated shellfish extract to the dipping sauce nearest Mr. Choi. It was odorless, colorless. It was lethal. She placed the tray on the table and retreated, her job done. From a service corridor, she watched. Mr. Choi, laughing at his own joke, picked up a dumpling, dipped it generously, and put it in his mouth. The effect was almost immediate. His laughter cut off into a choked gasp. His face began to swell, turning a blotchy red. He clawed at his throat, his eyes wide with panic. His men erupted into chaos, shouting for a medic, for his auto-injector. That was the signal. Jin Woo's men stormed the room. The fight was swift, brutal, and surgically precise. With their leader incapacitated, the Choi clan's enforcers were disorganized and quickly subdued. Chloe didn't watch. She had done her part. She slipped out the back, her body trembling with the enormity of what she had done. She hadn't held a gun, but she had wielded death all the same. The line she'd crossed was now an unbridgeable chasm. When it was over, Jin Woo found her in the alley behind the restaurant, leaning against the cold brick wall, the city lights feeling a million miles away. The sounds of sirens were growing closer. He walked to her, his suit immaculate despite the violence he had just orchestrated. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't say a word. He reached out and gently took her hand, the one that had held the dropper. He turned it over, studying her palm as if it held the secrets of the universe. Then he looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "They say loyalty is bought with blood or with money," he said, his voice quiet but absolute in the echoing alley. "They are wrong." He enclosed her hand in both of his grip warm and firm. "You gave me yours when you had no reason to. It is the only thing I own that has any value." It was not a confession of love. It was an acknowledgement of a bond forged in blood and fear, a truth more profound than any simple sentiment. He was claiming her, not as a possession, but as an irremovable part of himself. The cost of that claim was her old life, her innocence, the woman she used to be. She had traded it all for this man, for this dark, violent world. And in that moment, she felt no regret. They stood in his penthouse, the war over, looking out at the glittering sprawl of souls spread beneath them like a conquered kingdom. The city was his again, quiet and subservient. She was no longer in scrubs or a waitress uniform, but a simple, elegant black dress that had been waiting for her in the closet. The silence in the room was no longer tense, but comfortable, settled. He came to stand behind her, not touching, but so close she could feel the heat from his body, could smell the familiar scent of sandalwood and smoke. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't need to. The choice had been made in a hospital corridor, in a wrecked car, in a bloody restaurant kitchen. He said her name, just her name, a low murmur in the vast, quiet space. Chloe. The sound of it was a promise and a cage, a shield and a weapon. And for the first time, looking at their two reflections against the endless backdrop of city lights, she no longer saw a difference. She leaned back almost imperceptibly, the slightest movement, a silent acceptance that sealed her fate and began her new life.